it sort of felt like a once in a lifetime thing. The challenge was, how do you ship a game that potentially will have a lot of excitement and interest and a huge burst of players and so on globally simultaneously, and not have the servers fall down and so on. And many of these people were experienced with Warcraft, that worked on that team for many years, or were aware of it. And that's a testament to the sheer determination, but also brilliance of a lot of these engineers that were involved in, understanding how to best scale these things. There were some guys that part of the reliability and server teams that sort of came together for the last few weeks. And spent almost all their time in this sort of war room that we had fashioned out of a meeting room, just to start to sort of get things ready and prepare themselves, and so on. And so, yeah, it was brilliant. It was an amazing thing to watch.
You've spent over a decade at Blizzard, working for Overwatch, Overwatch 2, as a senior engineering manager. I'm just really excited to be able to speak to you because I love Overwatch. I've played the game. I think it's one of the biggest FPSs in the last quarter century, and it's a great honor.
Well, yeah, I'm excited to be here and happy to share some of my experiences.
So, how did you originally get into engineering? How did that pathway lead you to doing that discipline?
I took a couple of courses at college, which in I grew up in Australia, and so in Australia, college is year 11 and 12, and so they had a couple of courses there, which were, funnily enough, typing was one course, and word processing was the other one. And through that, I got exposed to some people who were already fairly excited to be leveraging programming, and I got some inspiration from them. My father also is a scientist, and so he was using VB at the time, Visual Basic, to power some of his hardware at his lab. And he had a huge textbook at home. Um, and he sort of, it was just sitting there, and I was like, "What's this VB?" And I started looking at it and getting a feel for it. And so I realized that you could make programs with this. And so we had a computer at home, and so he was using that, but he allowed me to use it. And I I created this kind of like card game, like maybe not dissimilar to solitaire, and I thought it was tremendous fun. It was fantastic, and so I had decided around that time, plus with some influence from some of my friends, that that was interesting to me, and I kind of felt like I had the mindset for it. I enjoyed the logic of it, just in the way the syntax was organized, and how it could be used to get an outcome. And I just love to sort of understand, when I finally understood that you could use that knowledge to create something from nothing. That was incredibly special for me. And so around that time, it was like maybe like 95, 96. I had to decide on what I wanted to do at university. And so there was computer science that was available. um, and so, yeah, that's what I chose, and that's how I got into it. And so ultimately, I think I'd probably credit my dad for that one, just because of just having those materials sitting around at home. He never said anything to me about looking at it, but just sort of left it around, and I sort of picked it up out of curiosity, and that's where it started from.
Yeah, and
Um,
how I've seen people define engineering, programming is like you're taking blocks of code that you're adding on top of other blocks and you're building out kind of functions, right?
uh
So
sure.
when you were doing this, did it map out like was games always an obvious kind of next step? Was that always something that you wanted to do,
Uh,
or you just did you want to
no.
build other systems?
So I think for me, what was exciting was like I said, the idea that you could assemble some code together, and then you get a result on the screen, and then you could sort of tweak that and shift what you've created into other things, or into better things, and that sort of iteration loop was something that was exciting for me. With respect to games, I never even thought I would ever be able to work in games, or even knew that that was an option, because in Australia, especially, gaming existed in terms of game development, but it wasn't. Um, it wasn't terribly available as a career choice. And so in the city in which I grew up in, which was called Canberra, is the capital of Australia. It's kind of like DC. It has, a lot of government there, and predominantly a lot of the work that's there with respect to programming is government related work, to help them, make systems for, to deliver policy and other things like that. Um, and so, that was not something that I was sort of, even really aware of as an option at the time. So my passions were driven by, the idea that I could solve problems, that I could make things that others could use, using programming. And so that was, I enjoyed that a lot. It was a lot of fun.
And then how soon did that position up to Blizzard come? Because obviously what I picked up from you and what I've noticed from other guests is that getting into games is always a bit scrappy. It's not something you expect. You kind of just land into it and then you kind of grow into that role. And it's fascinating to hear so many great game developers, designers, artists all say the same thing. I just followed kind of something that interested me. And then all of a sudden this opportunity came and I just kind of ran with it. So, how did that kind of develop? What's that timeline to Blizzard?
It was basically that, an opportunity arose that, I was excited about. I actually work with, a friend of mine, Stephen Nees, in, Australia, during my time, doing, I was doing consulting work for the government mostly in terms of those, contracting, engineering roles. And, we met during a large program of work called the Change Program, which was on, for the, ATO, which is the equivalent of the IRS, basically. Um, and it's at one point he actually scored a position, overseas at Blizzard, and I didn't really sort of, you know, think too much of it from my own perspective. I was happy for him and excited for him, that he could go over and do that. I think that was really, something that not many people I knew ever did. So that was really exciting. And he was there over there for a few years, and he sort of reached out to me a few times and said, "Hey, do you want to, come and work with me?" We were very good friends, throughout those years, and so I always said no, 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 because I have my family and my life was in Australia. And then at one point, about 12 years into my career here in Australia, so like that was like what 2012, I think. He reached out and said, "Hey, what do you think?" Um, and I said okay. And the reason why was a couple of things. First, I felt like I'd been doing what I was doing for a while now. I was 5 years into that position that I was in. Um, and secondly, I felt like the position that he had available, which was senior engineering manager, was something that really appealed to me. And there was an opportunity to go over there and have an adventure and go see him and so on. And so yeah, that's I said yes, okay, and then it took like a year and a half or something to sort out all the visas and everything. Um, but it was really my first opportunity to really step into a leadership role as well. And that was something that was very exciting for me too, because I had gone through the sort of the progression of, junior engineer all the way through to lead software engineer in Australia. But I had never had the chance to just be a manager of engineers. And so that's what that role was. It was, hey, like come here and be a manager for, 10 to 15 engineers. And so that was tremendously exciting for me. Now, in addition to all of that, of course, I was aware of World of Warcraft and, Diablo, and I was a huge fan of those games. I was playing those games, often with my friend overseas, with Steven, who, he would sort of tell me, "Hey, let's get on and play." And, there's a new patch and, everything else. And so, I actually played WoW for 2 years and I was raiding with him and, doing stuff like that. Um, I was a big fan of Diablo. Hearthstone was really exciting as well, when it came out. That was a lot of fun. And, it's just, hey, let's go over there and see how these things are made and what does it take to, be an engineer in a company like that? Um, what are the opportunities to learn and grow from that? And how can I sort of immerse myself in a culture in an environment where everyone obviously is very excited and passionate about games, which is completely different to the world I was working in, where people are there sort of earning their paycheck. But I'm not sure if a lot of the engineers were passionate about writing systems for, taxation or businesses or things like that. Certainly people took pride in their work, and so did I. Like there's obviously complicated, challenges there. And I was excited to deliver quality work. But I think it's a different level when you're personally passionate about, the things that you're creating, and you understand as well that many other people, the consumers of that output, are also extremely passionate about it. It's a huge shift.
Yeah, I mean, clearly an exciting prospect to go over to Blizzard, especially 2012. They really, in a lot of ways, were at their peak, or were through one of their many peaks. Well, talk me through that kind of growth period from kind of going junior to then becoming an engineering manager. Because I think on paper, when people read engineering manager, they think, okay, you're just the lead engineer in a team. But it's different from an IC role, which would be individual contributor for those listening, but also kind of the manager role where you're coaching teams and you're trying to create a system. I'm not as well versed in that. Could you kind of unpack that for me?
Okay, so I think as you work through your career as an engineer, you start with very heavy guidance. You're given small tasks with good guardrails in place, ideally, and you're left to sort of execute in that context, with close observation and feedback coming in regularly from your lead or your manager. And as you progress over time, that paradigm shifts because you start to become more comfortable with the iteration loop of making software. You get more familiar with, patterns and, writing good code versus not good code. You start to shift away from comfort with complexity. And, I didn't, I'm not excited because I wrote 10,000 lines of code. I'm excited because I wrote 100 lines of code to do the same thing. Things like this that sort of indicate maturity as people grow in their career. Additionally, getting better at working with others and understanding how an engineer can interface with other individuals, QA or a business analyst or a designer or product owner or something like that. They're all very numerous sort of skills to learn in that context as you grow and mature through those phases of those levels, if you will. But at some point, you start to recognize that some of these patterns may be interesting, not just if you're executing on it, but if you're helping others execute in that way as well. And you can start to, maybe some people start to form opinions about what good looks like versus not good. And as you go through your career, you have different roles where you have good leadership and not great leadership and so on. And maybe you start to become a little opinionated about some of those things. Um, and so maybe at some point you decide, well, I feel like I'm excited to try to help others, do this. And I think those are sort of some of the best managers and leaders where it's not about, hey, I want to be the one who makes the decisions because I am strongly opinionated about how things should go, but more about, hey, I have opinions about how I can enable others to be successful, or how I can enable a good outcome or a good result. And so that can be very motivating as well for that, to move in that direction. And so for me, I wasn't really sure, to be honest, like as I was sort of going through that process of more responsibility, I always felt like it was sort of a badge of honor to get there. Like, all right, well, I've made software, I've risen up to the level of senior engineer, maybe even lead software engineer. Um, if we say the next step would be to sort of take on responsibility for a larger team or even an entire engineering effort, what does that mean, and why is that, exciting or valuable or important? And for me, it just felt, I think at first, I just sort of felt like it was a natural progression that would sort of highlight or, um, uh, sort of indicate that, you sort of you've hit that level and it's a natural progression. I didn't really sort of consider that there are folks that don't really want to do that or maybe never will do that, whereas others sort of actively chase that. And so, yeah, I think it's very personal. Everyone goes through a different sort of like trajectory when it comes to their career and the paths they take. Um, but for me, I was very excited originally, to sort of be the the person responsible for an effort, working with a number of engineers to help them be successful.
Talk me through the IC part again and being a manager, because I remember when I worked in various other game studios, kind of my manager would sit me down and say, "You can pick a path now. You can become an IC, an individual contributor, or you can go into management." And I always found that odd because I thought I don't really know exactly. Like if I become a if I go into management, does that mean I kind of get isolated a bit, where I have to kind of manage people directly, but I'm not really working directly on what I love to do, which is build games and maybe do a bit of design and stuff like that. I worked in product, but I had my hands in a lot of different baskets. And if instead I decide to go in IC, does that mean I'm never going to grow in this company because management tends to be seen as kind of, where everyone heads up to, like that's the ladder. So like I'm speaking to you very genuinely. I've always found that like a bit of a weird bifurcation of a career. How would you kind of unpack that?
I agree with you. I mean, I think it yeah, this is where a good manager can be quite valuable because they can help you quite, internalize what that means. That's often a struggle for many people because there are these examples of where you say, "Hey, I need someone who can be responsible for this area of contribution, say gameplay engineering, right?" And you look and you say, "Hey, this is a fantastic gameplay engineer. I should have them be the lead or the manager." And it often takes them away from their day-to-day activities of producing, gameplay experiences. And so it can be a very challenging decision for someone to make because you do have that idea that you're not actually contributing anything valuable. You can sort of feel that way sometimes because you've gone from producing something tangible like code or an in-game experience to nothing, maybe conversations. You're in meetings all day long, or you were talking to people, trying to figure out what we're doing next, or whatever it is, and that can feel like you've really produced nothing tangible at all. So going back to what you were talking about in your question, I think um, it can be quite difficult to really understand whether or not you want to be an IC or uh, a lead. Um, and again, there could be maybe if I came to you earlier in your career and sort of said to you, you have to choose one or the other, I think that would be very irresponsible personally. I think the important thing there to do would be to say, take the time to explore the IC side and develop your skill set and understanding of how software is made and delivered consistently. But while you're doing that, pay attention to those that inspire you, the senior engineers, the leaders and managers around you, and try to get a sense of what they're doing, why they're doing those things. Take the time to ask them questions about that to build an understanding of what some of the nuances or considerations that are there. And if that's interesting to you and exciting to you, then maybe you've sort of discovered that there's something there that excites you. But in order to be a lead or a manager, an effective lead or a manager, it does help to go through some of the motions of of making software so that when you're helping others do the same thing, you've been through some of those trenches and experienced some of the highs and lows and challenges and how to solve some of those problems. That experience is important. It can help you achieve that. And so for most people, I would say, hey, if you are interested in being a lead, great. Like keep that in mind. Pay attention to what's going on around you. Even consider looking at literature, reading blogs and other things that managers and leads produce. But really, narrow in on your craft and feel comfortable with delivering work your way up through the engineering levels. And then when you feel like you're ready and you really want to pursue that more seriously, have that conversation with your lead or manager and let them know that that's something that is your goal, your where you want to get to, and work towards that. I think pushing for that from, very early on could be challenging.
And for someone that's listening that maybe they've played games their whole lives, but they don't really know what engineering means in a game. Like maybe we have to go a little bit more, like those questions explain something like you're a 5-year-old. I guess I'm asking from my point of view, I'm not an engineer. I've been a product person for a long time. But I kind of understand that in games, you have like the game engine, you have content, you're working with artists to bring in textures and models, and there's kind of this tandem back and forth in building these experiences. But for someone who's listening that says, gosh, I love Overwatch, I've played it so much, but I have no idea what an engineer would be doing on a game like that has such great polish and it just runs really well. What does it mean to be an engineer in that capacity?
Well, I mean, one of the things you mentioned there is a huge clue that runs really well. Uh, it that doesn't come for free. That's engineers taking the time to look at the code and figure out, is it performant? Why is it not performant if it's not? And where do I need to make it, put effort in to engineer better performance? And so there are reasons for that, the way that data is being handled, for example, or the way that various different, say, drivers are utilized, on the engine side for graphics and so on. But um, I mean, there are many different reasons for why performance could be good or bad. But and that's a skill in itself, by the way, is learning how to measure performance, understand if it's good or bad, and understand how to tackle that so that you can improve it. But the reality is that as more code is added, performance tends to degrade because people get things in quickly, iterate fast, and then it creates some inefficiencies perhaps. And so it's a constant battle to keep that going. But in general, engineering on a game team. And this is something that I learned as well because prior to joining Blizzard, I really didn't have too many ideas on how that exactly went. I had a sense of it, but not to the level that perhaps I do now. But um, I think the easiest way to talk about it to someone who wants to understand that is that a game is made up of a lot of different things, um, and all of those things need to come together for the game to be viable. So, for example, you need audio in a game. Okay, like you need the sounds. And so in order to have audio in the game, you need some kind of a sound engine, right? And so on Overwatch, we were using one, and it was called WWise. And so for that one, you need to take this engine and you need to attach it to the game, I guess, and then connect the sounds to it, and then the sounds play in the game. But it's a little more than that because if you think about it, you also have to do things like if I press the button on the mouse and the gun shoots, I have to match the sounds to the gun shooting, for example. Um, and so you need to also do a bunch of, say, configuration, let's say, to wire up the sounds to the various events that are going on inside the game. Now, every now and then, you'll have a situation where someone super clever comes along and says, "Hey, what about if we did X?" And it's a brilliant idea, and everyone loves it. And then you go to this sound engine, you say, "Hey, I want to do X," and the sound engine doesn't support that at all. And so you might have to do some engineering work to enable that feature to come to life. And so it might mean that you have to, make some modifications, to the engine or to the game or something like that in order to support whatever it is that you're trying to do. And so for games that are using these sorts of, engines, Unreal, Unity, audio engines, etc., there can be moments where customization is required. So getting back to game engineering, um, you have a group of individuals, say on Overwatch, we had maybe at the most like 65 engineers, but they're not all working on gameplay or, you know, tools or something. They're all separated out into their various areas of contribution. And so you have tools engineers, they work on the game editor to, again, because someone wants to do something amazing. For example, in Overwatch, we had mythic skins, right? And so mythic skins wasn't something that, could be done out of the box. It needed tooling to support it. And so that needed engineering support to build, to enable, that to be created for the game. Um, we have, gameplay engineers, we have engine engineers, we have audio engineers, we have reliability engineers. And so folks that are challenged with monitoring the game in production and making sure that things go well and, dealing with, deploying patches and managing players, throughout the patch process, et cetera, et cetera. There were server engineers who manage all the data and the servers for the game, um, UI engineering, uh, and so I think in general, um, each area has its own set of unique challenges and obstacles that they're trying to accomplish. And so on the engine side, we have engine engineers as well. There's graphics and systems, for example. And so again, someone says, "Hey, I want to see a little bit of a shimmer in the character's eye when they're on the screen." And so, that may not exist. And so someone needs to figure out how to, graphically create, program that into the engine so that it's an effect that can be made available to, artists, for example.
And if I
Um,
can say, I can imagine at Blizzard that was happening all the time, right? Like you have lots of like ingenious people saying, "Let's do this. Let's add
I mean,
this tiny thing." Like, was it
yeah, I
just
mean,
dealing with constant innovation?
that's game development because people get excited about, what they're making and they want to make the best possible thing they can so players enjoy it. And these are craftspeople. That's what they're great at is sort of coming up with these great ideas that really, make these games outstanding. And the job of the engineer on the team is to help them realize these experiences in a way that's playable, realistically playable, in the game. And so it is true that there are some things that are just, it's just not possible to do certain things with the technology landscape or the engine that limits it, or perhaps the spec, right? Like, if we support a certain range of capabilities in terms of hardware, then you have to be true to that as well. Um, so yeah, so engineers are generally there to improve performance, to help bring, new concepts to the screen that folks are excited about delivering, um, and just to create capability, either in the tooling or the game itself. It could be other things as well, like on the reliability side. It could be like helping scale players in um, in deployment environments appropriately. um, it could be other things as well. Like, for example, server engineers spend a lot of time optimizing the servers so they run as cheaply as possible, because that's important as well. To reduce the amount of compute that's necessary, for example, because the game runs smoother and also costs go down. So there are important challenges to solve in that context as well.
Then in my head, in my experience, I've seen that a lot of times you'll have design or product coming up with a feature or an improvement, and then it kind of gets passed down to engineering and production where they kind of figure out, okay, this is the capacity we have. The
Uh,
producer will say, we've got kind of these teams that are available. This is the work. This is where we are. And then engineers will be like, okay, great. I think I can do that. They get assigned. And that is the process, I think, typically in my head. But I'm wondering, because you mentioned these engineers, they love their craft. They are playing the game and they see something and they're like, I want to fix that or I want to improve that. What is the relationship between design and engineering in a company, in a team like Overwatch that is building such a great game?
I think everyone understands that there is way more that we want to do than we can do. And so that's always the biggest challenge with in those contexts is, what are the right things that we should be working on? Where can we best spend our time? And what are some of the axes or the constraints relative to that? And so for most ICs, they're not sort of in that world. They're sort of, working outside of that. But, when it comes to production and design and just general engineering direction as well, decisions need to be made to figure out, what are we committing to in terms of the next patch? What is the tech debt or other things that we need to do to enable us to be able to, continue to support the game, or the, experimental work that needs to be done that may, allow us to deliver, features in the future. Um, Against the raft of, I want to do this, there's some bugs that really annoy the players. We should fix those. Um, there's some performance work that needs to be done, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's just a huge equation of just trying to balance all of that to try to figure out how to best serve all the needs, I guess. Um, Much of it is collaborative in the sense that people get together and talk about things and figure out perhaps what the best way forward is there when it comes to certain specific decisions that should be made about priorities. Um, for engineers, you can sometimes reward yourself, find ways to reward yourself in those contexts, depending on how big those things are. So, for example, if there's a small bug that's bothering players, but it's not sort of important enough for us to put a lot of time and effort in. Sometimes engineers can, you know, get their prioritized work done, and then reward themselves with a little, I say reward themselves with a little, with some small time to sort of go and fix this annoying bug that some players find annoying. Um, and so sometimes you can sort of advocate for those things with your lead, to say, "Hey, I'm really excited to fix this," or "I'm passionate about addressing that," or I think, I need some time here in the code, and you can advocate for those sorts of things. And so it is important to sort of have that communication, that two-way communication between an engineer at the ground level who's implementing things and the decision makers maybe who are trying to prioritize work, to really understand, is this something that's important to someone? Is it important that we spend time on it? Why? And, how does that factor into other things that we're trying to get done as well? Yeah, it can be a big challenge
Yeah, I really like the idea of it being an equation, like you are trying to balance and figure out
from
what
the
is the
engineer's
best next
perspective.
thing to do, yeah, from the engineering perspective. But okay, I have a spicy one then. Talk to me about tech debt, because this is something that even in class when I teach aspiring product managers to kind of get into product and work with engineers, tech debt is always this kind of contentious thing where it's like, yeah, we have clear issues in the game. There are bugs, maybe there are things that the players aren't happy about. Um, and we need to fix them at some point, but we also have deadlines and features that we've promised or that we've kind of set the expectation for. How how do you see tech debt? Like, how would you explain it to someone again that is looking in and says, "Well, I heard this term, but I don't know what that means. Debt of what?"
So technical debt is when you write code without consideration for perhaps for like how you can best do it, or how you can avoid problems in the future. And so it happens a lot in game development because game development is highly iterative. We just want to get something onto the screen as quickly as possible so people can play test it or try it out. um, and so often you make choices that maybe shortcuts, or you take shortcuts or other things that can sort of get things happening very quickly. And when you do that, sometimes you go far long enough where it might be challenging to go back and redo it, or address those issues. And so you sort of make peace with that, to a certain extent, and you ship it, and you say, all right, well, the feature works, it's bug free. It's not the best, it's certainly not extensible, and it's going to cause us problems in the future. But it sort of got us past the line at the time when it was important to do so. And if you do that often enough, that builds up, um, and which can start to become a problem. The way it manifests mostly are in areas where either performance, is impacted because it's not things aren't written in a performant way, and so it requires a re-architecture to improve that, or bugs. And so sometimes if there's tech debt in the code, or system is not written well, it can actually be a place where it produces a lot of bugs. And so it's one tactic to actually address a system that produces a lot of bugs in the wild, rather than just fixing the bugs forever, is to go back and re-architect that system, to solidify that system, and so it's not producing as many bugs. And often the reason for it is tech debt. So tech debt, you can approach that in various different ways. I think sometimes it can be very obvious that there are problems, and you can make that case very easily. And so, in terms of prioritization of work, if you're saying, "Hey, I want to trade off this feature for addressing this tech debt," if that tech debt is causing significant bugs in the wild, for example, that's a pretty straightforward discussion, I think. And so you can often convince folks that a very impactful, sort of issue in the code is something that's worth fixing, both for the benefit of the players, but also, for us as well, because we're not fixing so many bugs, which are expensive, to fix. Other times it's a little more subtle, and so engineers have their own personal preferences about things, like they're not happy with the way that a system was laid out, and so they want to revisit that system at some point, to bake in a little more, you know, extensibility or flexibility in the system, or maybe they want to introduce a bit better telemetry or other things like that that could be valuable for monitoring and production, things like that. And so typically you would want to, have a look at that, understand exactly what it's going to take to get it done, and then, pitch that as an idea or an internal feature or something like that. And if it's something that folks agree is important to spend time on, then we can do that. But I mean, again, the reality is that there's way too much work to do than there is people to do it. And so it is true that there are some things that will never, be fixed or never be addressed. Again, it always comes down to that balance, that equation of like, is it disruptive? Is it limiting us? Right? That could be an example of like some tech debt that prevents us from going in a certain direction with a certain feature. And so, okay, well, we have to go back and rewrite that in order to, get this thing that we're trying to produce down the line. And so, yeah, it just really just takes a lot of um, uh, you need an understanding of what that tech debt looks like, what the ramifications of it are, how much it will take to fix it. Um, and often that can be a challenge as well, because sometimes you look at a thing and you say, "Oh, that's easy. I'll just, that'll be a day." And then you get into the depths of
Yeah.
it, and suddenly, 3 days later, you're like, "What am I still doing here?" Um, but that can be quite common, and so there's risk there as well when it comes to doing those sorts of things, because of those sort of landmines that are sort of hidden away deep in the depths of the code somewhere, where you sort of go in and you're like, yeah, this is easy to take care of, but unfortunately 8 other things depend on it, which I didn't realize. And so now, you know, I have to fix this, but then also go and adjust all those things. And when I did that, it broke a bunch of stuff. And now there's a huge amount of risk, and nobody wants to put this in production because we can't be sure that, something's not broken. And, it can go on and on and on. And so, yeah, it can be quite challenging. And for
I think
engineers, that can be quite frustrating as well, honestly.
I think that's what players don't understand often. I didn't understand this myself until I started working in the industry. Is that a bug may be obvious, a bug may be there in the game, but to resolve it, to go into the investigation and realize that there are dependencies, or that often that bug is a symptom of another bug, which is a symptom of another one, and you have to kind of chase it. Um, it's not super straightforward. And sometimes I just think, snap your fingers, figure the code, change a couple letters, move some stuff around, some lines, and it fixes itself. But it's
Exactly.
always much more complex, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, they're always the low-hanging fruit, which we love to to address. And believe me, I mean, if the team had the time, they would love to fix all of the bugs. And it is something that folks are quite passionate about, is the quality of the game, because as craftspeople, it's a direct reflection of your own skills and contributions. That if you write something and put that out into production and there are bugs associated with it, that's a many people feel very personal about that, and they certainly don't want to produce something that um, because of bugs specifically, frustrates players or causes issues like that. Like, this is not something that, any person who, if this is their craft, they want their craft to be impeccable if possible, or at least, bug free. Yeah.
I mean, it does speak to the culture of Blizzard, though. I've worked in other companies, and sometimes we'll leave bugs there. We just can't get to it. Players are not happy, and I mean, when you play Overwatch and you play a lot of other Blizzard games, there is a level of polish and just smoothness to how everything runs that you
Mm.
think it must have been this way when it came out the box, but it's always kind of this journey to get there, and a lot of talented people, a lot of passionate people just wanting to make sure it really runs smoothly.
Right.
Um, out of curiosity, like, are there any kind of bugs that kind of you've experienced working on Overwatch that kind of were like little pesky ones that you were able to fix? So you thought, this one was a bit. I don't know if you could speak on that, but I genuinely would be fascinated.
Nothing external. Uh, no, nothing external. Only internal, and even then, just a handful, really. Uh, yeah, I mean, for me, we'll get into this a little bit later, I think, but for me,
Yeah.
the role took a shift away from, you know, uh, contributions like that. And the problem is that you have to find a way to do these things without disturbing others. Because usually the way you would approach this is you would say, all right, well, I want to, contribute. And so something tangible, right? I was talking about tangibility before.
Yeah.
Okay, I feel like contributing something tangible to the code base. And so I'm going to go and do some exploration and maybe like, yeah, I'll be aware of a bug or something like that that I think, would be nice to fix. And I did this a couple of times where you sort of go in and you start to look and you say, all right, well, here's the problem. And that's a little bit, frustrating for me personally, for example, as a player. So I'm sure other people are bothered by this. Let me see if I can fix it, and I'll be my own hero or something like that. Um, and so I went in, you go in and you start exploring and you start looking at it. And then suddenly you start to realize, and this happened on every occasion that I did this, and it wasn't that many, but maybe like, 3 or 4 times I did this. And you start to realize, okay, this isn't as simple as what I thought. And a lot of the bugs that I was looking at were like UI related bugs, for example, that sort of presented in the HUD or, like just elements of UI, rather than sort of, specific gameplay, behaviors. Like, like if a grappling hook didn't hit correctly or if a wall climb was weird, I didn't really sort of have the skill set necessary to even, figure out how to, approach addressing some of those sorts of problems. Um, because they can be quite complex, those bugs. You need a lot of 3D math and understanding of the 3D space and everything else. Reinhardt's hammer and charge were actually really complex problems to solve, for example. And so if you notice sort of weirdness there, that could be like a multiple month thing where you go and look at that and try to figure it out. Um, and if that's not your primary responsibility, which it wasn't for me, it's not realistic to want to sort of address that. But I did see some small things and I thought, well, maybe I could look. And so I went and looked and I and you sort of figure out where the issue is. Um, but a lot of these things are sort of somewhat, not always, but somewhat tightly coupled. And so if you're making a change like that, usually you require some review from people. Maybe you need a play test. Maybe you need to let it sit and bake for a while to make sure that you haven't impacted other things in those sorts of ways. And so already, even if I'm talking to even one or two more people, I'm already disrupting them from their priorities. And as much as I would have loved to like really spend some time to do that and then to, address issues and kick off play tests and other things like that, it's just not something I felt comfortable doing because I know how hard all the engineers are working to get their own things done. And so I had to respect the prioritization machine, if you will, in that context. It didn't stop me from going and chatting with folks. I had a lot of conversations about some of these things, maybe with matchmaking or maybe with UI or, other things that were sort of interesting to me or fascinating, or I just wanted to explore why, and so often those conversations would be, hey, I noticed this. Why is it like that? Oh, well, yeah, we're aware of that. Here's a 5 year, history of why it's like that. And if you want to fix it, this is what it's going to take, you know? And so it was more often that than, oh no, we didn't know, and it's a simple 5-minute fix. And so, that that's sort of what it came down to more than anything else. And I'll give you another example. The tools lead, Rowan Rowan Hamilton on the team. I went to him and I said to him, "Hey, Rowan, look, my background's in, like, as you know, my background's in C sharp and, I'm very comfortable with C sharp. Our game editor was written in C sharp. I said, give me a couple of bugs, just to sort of do in my spare time, shouldn't really affect the team or anything. Give me something small. He gave me a bug and I went and started looking into it. And it was related to a search type bug. And I found it, figured out what the problem was, and I had assembled a fix. And he said, all right, go talk to this engineer here. Um, so they can sort of review what you've done, and then if it's good, we'll check it in. I said, all right, great. I went and talked to that engineer, and he's like, no, I've already got an idea of how I want to revamp this entire thing. It's coming up here. This is great, but it's going to be you'll do it and then we'll have to throw it all out. And so, it was sort of like, again, that context was missing. And I held Rowan responsible for that a little bit, but, but in any event, it can be very much like that. And the answer ultimately is that there's very little that we're not already aware of, number one. Players report things, bugs come in, our QA are exceptional, and so you generally are very aware. And folks that write these systems, they know often where the weaknesses are, where the issues are. Um, but there's often a plan in their mind as well of how they're going to approach these things, and that plan may extend years into the future. And the idea behind it is that they know that for example, the tools engineer, he knows that that search capability is not optimal. He knows roughly why it's not optimal. He doesn't have time right now to fix it, but he knows at some point he's going to get that time, and he already has a rough idea of what exactly he's going to do um, to address that. And so he told me, no, don't touch this because, you know, it's going to be totally revamped. I said, okay, no worries, but either way, it was a lot of fun to sort of push into there, and play with it a little bit. Um, when AI, started to become a little bit more available, to use in code, that was interesting as well because you could take a code base, not the Overwatch code base, but you could take a code base from somewhere um, that's available online, for example, like open source games and things like that. And you could point the AI at it and you could say, hey, like find me optimizations or find me bugs or find me things that you think could be a problem. Um, and then, that's a really fascinating thing to do as well, to see what, you know, what it can pull out of there, for example. And then you could even try fixing it maybe and see how that goes. Um, on Overwatch, we have the capability of like, it's called static code analysis. So nightly, it sort of looks at the code and finds potential issues, not bugs necessarily, but just specifically issues around the way the code is written. And then it can provide those as well. And so engineers are expected to fix those regularly and to keep those, those types of bugs low. Um, and so a lot of those sort of low hanging fruit type bugs are often, um, quickly addressed. Either QA finds them or, static code analysis digs them out. And, those could be, structural type things.
So how important is communication overall? Because if you have a lot of different teams that are aware of these bugs, but maybe on the outside players are like, "Ah, this still hasn't been fixed." And then maybe even for in a lot of ways, your responsibility as an engineering manager, or even like a product manager coming in and like maybe their MO is we gotta fix this area of the game because it needs to perform better because maybe there's an incentive in the organization, blah blah blah. Ultimately, communication is where it comes down to. What's your experience working? You worked in a very big team, 65. I mean, for me, 65 engineers is immense. Well, I know there are other larger games that may have 200s, and then sometimes there are armies. But how difficult is it to get communication right, and especially when it comes to bugs and people trying to manage their own refactors and then just trying to they have a timeline for their work. They just don't know when exactly they can do it optimally.
Yeah, I mean this is a thing that requires growth and maturity over time for the team itself. When I started on the team, it was 35 engineers, and then I grew the team to 65. And when I first started, for the most part, most people knew what everyone else was working on. It wasn't too difficult. We were talking a lot on the floor, and everyone was sort of sharing information. There were various planning processes that were going on with production as well to sort of bring visibility into what was going on at the team level, and then also at I say at the team at the sub team level, let's say, and then at the broader team level. And so there's always a production effort that sort of tries to quantify, I suppose, what it is that folks are working on, and what are we doing month over month, for example. Um, but as the team grows and gets bigger, yeah, I mean, it becomes a lot more challenging to do that. And so the ceremonies and the processes that we were using to accomplish that had to evolve as well. Um, Earlier on, there were some sub teams that weren't, using sort of task tracking software to get things done, especially highly iterative ones like gameplay, for example, who, you'd sort of create a task and, 10 minutes later it's obsolete maybe, and so it can be challenging to do that in that context. Um, but we started to organize ourselves over the years in ways that would bring better visibility into what people are working on and what their priorities are and how we agree on what priorities should be, broadly speaking. And there are sort of multiple levels of that. Within the team, it's within the sub team itself. So, like within the server team, they might make some decisions where they need to tackle a little bit of tech debt or address a bug or do a data repair or something like that. But then they're also, planning out a sprint, and so for a patch, maybe these are the things that they need to get done. And so, they'll sort of balance all of that in the context of that sprint. And then external to that, you have various disciplines. So there's server, but maybe gameplay. Maybe gameplay are depending on a feature that server is implementing, or vice versa, and they need to know about it. And so there's a sort of a higher level planning that's going on as well to try to understand or quantify patch over patch. What are the big beats that, server team's doing this, gameplay is doing that, engine is doing this, etc. And how does it tie in together? What are the dependencies? What are what do key stakeholders need to be aware of in those contexts? What are the yeah I'm depending on you to get that done so I can get my thing done. Let's talk to each other and make sure that we understand that those things are prioritized appropriately and so
I
on.
don't think people often realize it's like overlaps of dependencies. Like we're doing this work, so it can facilitate this work, but then for that work to happen, you got to have this work
Mm,
over here, and it's
yeah,
just like one. Oftentimes, it's just multiple projects all moving in just one direction. But
that's right. That's
and
right.
if there's one hiccup, everything changes, right? You can come to work one day and say, "Well, this tool broke, and so now we gotta move people around and fix this tool before because the reason is the priority's higher because it's going to be for
That's
this
right.
output or for this feature."
That's right.
And that's such a tricky balance to get
It
in
is.
games, and I don't think players don't realize when there's a delay or when there's an issue. It's because you're dealing with a lot of different people, a lot of people that may have there may be, like, a handful of people in the company that can do that specific job, but they're now tied up to another thing, and you have to wait. It's such a
Uh,
balancing act. It's an equation again.
It is, yeah, it is, and it's very organic, and so the team generally understands the ceremonies and the processes that are at play and how things are done, and then it's sort of that organic ballet that's sort of happening, as and it could be like you said, like a tool breaks or someone gets an idea, or something happens in the industry or something happens in the world, even that can sort of have influence or effect on some of these things. Um, yeah, and communicating that to players is also a challenge as well. And so you talk about communication. Well, there's internal, but then there's external as well. And obviously, Blizzard is very careful about the way that they communicate externally. And they're generally sort of very specific people that are engaging with the players. Right now for Overwatch, that's Aaron Keller, for example. We do sometimes put out who's the game director for the game. We do put out blog posts, for example, like engineering blogs and other things like that from time to time to explain sort of some complex things or some victories that we had in solving some tricky problems. And so there's some very nice blog posts on the Overwatch website that engineering posts that talk about some of those things. Um, but in general, the transparency is somewhat limited, and I've seen companies that basically, work on Trello or something like that, which is a task organization software.
Yeah.
If folks don't know that, it's kind of like I guess a Kanban board type thing, where you can visually see like what's in progress, what's planned, what's completed, etc., or what's not started, and they publish it publicly, and you can sort of see exactly what they're doing, what they're working on, what their current tasks are, and everything, which I think is a fascinating way of working. Um, I think for games that would put a tremendous amount of pressure on the devs, if that level of transparency was available, because a lot of it is experimental, and so we might put something out there and give it a try, and then after a few weeks realize it's not viable, and people might be excited about that, and then you sort of have to disappoint them, and so there are obviously limits to like how to go about doing that. But even for bugs, I mean, at times we'll acknowledge sort of, hey, we're aware of this issue and we're doing things to address that. Often live ops is doing that kind of communication. And so there is a reliability team there. And if there is sort of game impacting things, like for example, a bug in a map, like the geo is there's a hole in the in the geometry, and so players can fall through into nothingness.
Oblivion.
They may disable that map, right, until we can fix it, and so um, and it may be challenging to fix. Like maybe that map is not like hot fixable, for example, and so you have to wait until the next patch, and so you have to disable it. Then you have to let people know that hey, this is why we're doing that, etc. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different, sort of aspects to that.
I mean, what you brought up with the public roadmap really speaks to me. I think there's this internal excitement from management and perhaps even kind of the higher ups to promise features in a roadmap because you want to make it exciting for the player base. You want people to get excited for the release of a new patch or maybe the next iteration of the game, whatever it may be. And this isn't specifically of Overwatch. I think this is of games in general. We were creating something that brings a lot of happiness and joy to customers, and so you want to be able to promise that stuff, but then the reality of actually implementing it on the ground, like we just said earlier, things can change really fast. And as great as it is to have that public roadmap and be able to speak to players and say, "This is all we've got planned," it's like take
Right.
that with a pinch of salt. Like I've been in a situation where we promised a lot of things and
And under
we
delivered.
we
Yeah.
weren't able, we underdelivered,
Yeah.
and it's painful, especially when you're the torchbearer for something like
Yeah.
that.
And it's cool
Um,
to surprise the players as well and delight them, like of course you want to sort of, do a grand reveal and everything else. I think that goes a long way too. And I mean, it's fun for marketing and other people who like to, geek out on how we can best, sort of expose players to a feature. I mean, if you remember back in the day, the Sombra ARGs and all the stuff that we were doing there, that was an interesting time. But it was I saw the excitement from the players and everything, um, as we sort of led up to that BlizzCon and Sombra hacked the you know, Kaplan's opening video and stuff. It was amazing, like that was I was in that hole at that time and the reaction from the audience was just insane. So yeah, anyway, well, one of my special moments.
no, but please then let's pivot just a little bit then. Talk to me about how it was to kind of work on Overwatch from what I understand from its infancy in a lot of ways, and then kind of releasing it in 2016 where, I mean, spoiler, it won multiple Game of the Year awards. It was kind of heralded as this new, um, I want to say new take, but this new epitome of what an FPS shooter can be, the polish,
Mm,
the artwork. I
yeah.
just think how players played it, in a lot of ways, it led to some copycats. You had Marvel Heroes, like, people saw it and said, wow, this is an incredible game. What was that like overall to kind of be involved in such a moment?
Uh, well, I mean, as I look back on it, I mean, it sort of felt like a once in a lifetime thing, like it's not often that a game is I mean, it won more than 100 Game of the Year awards, which was just mind blowing to me, honestly. Like you know, w- we were confident, I think, that we enjoyed playing it. Like we were very, very happy with that because it was so much fun to play, and we had a lot of great play tests. And that for many game developers, that's a litmus test. Is it fun? Is it exciting? Do I feel like playing this all, am I looking forward to playing it? Um, and I mean internally, right? Before you ship anything. Um, and so it was very exciting. I joined in September of 2015. So I joined Blizzard a little earlier than that in 2013, but I joined Overwatch in 2015, and there were about 6 months away from ship at that point. And so, they had sort of, got the game into a pretty decent state by then. Um, and, there was a quiet excitement on the team that was starting to build, 6 months out. Um, and, people were really sort of geeking out on just sort of smoothing it out as much as they could, getting things, as performant as they could. There was a lot of, oh, I would say concern about various, platform challenges and other things like this that required work. There were still some unanswered questions on the technical side that still needed to be sort of addressed, and so it wasn't sort of, you know, it wasn't like all the problems had been solved. No, far from it. But there was a quiet anticipation and excitement there on the team. I could feel that, because people wanted to share it with the world. And I think that was incredibly intoxicating for folks. Like it's just so much fun. And I want everyone to enjoy this and see what, we've created as a team. And it's even more sort of complicated than that because I think there's also this underlying sense of we want to prove ourselves. Because if you recall, Overwatch was born out of a failed project, which was Project Titan, which was a very large and long-running project that ultimately Blizzard decided to discontinue. And out of that, there was this small team that sort of came out of it that was charged with find a way to sort of, you know, uh, perhaps and to be clear, I wasn't in any of these discussions, so I don't know exactly what was said, but perhaps find a way to sort of leverage the best parts of Titan into something that, people will enjoy and we could, sort of turn around. And so, that was the Overwatch team, and, um it wasn't called that then. They had a code name, I think, for the project, which was Prometheus. And Frank Pierce, one of the co-founders of Blizzard, sort of told us about that in my orientation when I first joined, which was cool. And he didn't tell us what it was, of course, but he said there's this project, it's Prometheus, and we're working on that. And so, um, yeah, um, I think there was that sense of we want to prove ourselves to the world and as well, that sort of excitement to share what we've made with everyone else. And towards at that point, they had already shared it internally with Blizzard, and so they had done like a company-wide play test, um, which was amazing. And in fact, the reason why I went and joined that team is because I played it, and it was just incredible. It blew me away. I'd never seen anything like it. And it was just I couldn't stop playing it. It was just amazing. It made me feel so good when I played it. That first time I played it, it just felt so great. The movement was so great. The shooting was great. It was just incredible. It just yeah. And I said to myself, I want to be a part of this. I want to be involved with it. And so they actually had a position open for engineering manager, and so I applied, and that's how I made it over to the team.
How do you get a game like that ready, though? Like, again, Blizzard has a
Yeah.
culture for bringing out games, for releasing them at the right time when they're ready to go. A lot of other game companies have taken the misstep of releasing a game because they had to, because maybe there was an expectation to generate a certain amount of revenue, blah, blah, blah. But Blizzard always said, even back with the Warcrafts and other games that they've done kind of earlier in their infancy, they always said, no, we're going to release this when it's ready, when we feel like it has that Blizzard sign of quality. How did that feel for Overwatch, which was like a new genre for the studio?
Um,
It felt like a brand new game. There were really high expectations.
there were
How
really high expectations.
how do you gear towards that, right? Like there's play testing, you're looking for bugs, you're going to manage the launch, like how many people are going to come through, like there are, servers can get over there could be lag. You want that first week of people playing to be perfect because you want the game to do great.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, all of those things. And we had an amazing engineering team, and particularly on the server and reliability side, um, they focused heavily on that. And in fact, our technical director at the time made it his top priority, to really because the challenge was how do you ship a game that potentially will have a lot of excitement and interest and a huge burst of players and so on globally simultaneously, and not have the servers fall down and so on. And so there has been a lot of many of these people were experienced with Warcraft, that worked on that team for many years, or were aware of it, aware of their challenges doing that. And so Warcraft, the lessons that sort of came out of that, were valuable for many of these folks as well. But there was a deliberate effort made to to make these things as performant as possible, and to also evaluate that. And so there are concepts like stress testing, for example, where you could sort of spin up tests that simulate millions of players, and there was, technology that allowed them to, to do that, for example. Um, but like there these are very challenging things to do, and it's very difficult to anticipate all of the different problems. But at the end of the day, I think the launch went really well, and it was sort of credited as one of the smoothest launches that had been done for that scale in quite a while, and that's a testament to the determination, the sheer determination, but also brilliance of a lot of these engineers that were involved in, understanding how to best scale these things. And it wasn't just server and reliability. I mean, there are other aspects as well. That that are important too, in the way that, say, the matchmaking would function, and other things like that matter when you're dealing with things at scale. Because previously you're sort of, it's just the team that's playtesting these things, and so it's very difficult. And then on top of that, of course, you need your designers need to be paying attention so they can quickly adjust, play, balance the game and other things like that. And so yeah, there's a lot that goes into, shipping a game for the first time and managing that appropriately. Um, yeah, I can't get too deep into the specifics of it, but I will say that it was done very deliberately, and for the most part, most of the ideas that decisions that were made serve the team quite well, serve the game well. So that was very fortunate. But again, it was also due to the collective experience and brilliance of a lot of these folks, that really put in a ton of effort to bring us to that line. There were some guys that part of the reliability and server teams that sort of came together for the last few weeks, and spent almost all their time in this sort of war room that we had fashioned out of a meeting room, just to start to sort of get things ready and prepare themselves, and so on. And so, yeah, it was brilliant. It was an amazing thing to watch, honestly. And for the most part, during those last few months in particular, I spent more time just sort of listening and watching, rather than, executing in my role, because everyone was just hyper focused on that, and nothing else was sort of, in focus at the time, really, beyond, hey, all hands on deck, this is what needs to be done. Of course, others on the team were looking at the future and what day one would look like, and beyond. But yeah, that was a huge effort.
Yeah, I think, in a lot of ways, when you're releasing a game like that, it's when you in general, when you're building a game, it's like you guys are saying, you're incubating it from the outside world.
Mm,
Like, you're playing it yourselves, you're having fun with it, you're finding your own problems. Maybe you have some internal play tests, maybe you bring in some external people with an NDA to try it, but largely you're not releasing it into the wild where all of a sudden you have millions of people trying to break the game in every way, trying to do every single thing that you
exactly.
may have not imagined. What's that like from an engineering perspective? Because I always find that so interesting that you're making this game, you're like, all right, this is going to work. We know it's going to work this way. And then one player comes along and just says, no, let's just break it that way. And we would have never thought of that. It's such a
Well,
wild
it's
thing.
it's tremendously exciting. I mean, like you're on the edge of your seat the whole time. Um, I think games can be challenging because it can be difficult to fix things in games in a reasonable way. Um, if you have millions of players playing in matches and you need to take the game down, that can be a hugely impactful thing, for example. And so there can be a lot of nervousness around that. If we find something, what is our playbook? How are we going? Is it disable a map? Is it disable a hero? Is it, bring down the entire game? What are the sort of the levels that sort of describe what needs to happen? And early on, I think that was we had an understanding of that, but it wasn't terribly mature. And that playbook developed over time to sort of to the maturity that it is today, I guess. Um, but for the longest time, we were sort of like almost underwater, like, because you're sort of trying to manage all the things, all the data that's coming in, all of the bugs, all of the exceptions, the issues, concerns, etc. people are watching streams all the time and trying to sort of, pay attention to Reddit and, you know, X and, Twitter at the time, and so on, just to sort of see is anything sort of bubbling to the surface that, is becoming sort of viral or popular or big or, exploits or hacks or cheats or this or I mean, anti-cheat is a whole, you
Oh, that's a
know,
whole
you, yeah,
can
you
of
could have a
worms.
whole, conversation about that as well. But, um, yeah, again, it comes down to the idea that these are craftspeople and they're very excited about what they've made and they want everyone to experience it like they do and have a great experience. And if things get in the way of that, it's critical. People are very sort of personally not thrilled about that. Um, I mean, besides the fact that it's bad for, the company and the game and everything else, but like it's a very nervous situation to be in, honestly. And I'm pretty, that day everyone was very quiet for the first, you know, few hours as they're sort of watching things unfold, um, and just sort of paying attention to where, telemetry and other things that are going on. Um, and if I recall correctly, maybe at around about 4 or 5 PM that day, later in the days when people started to actually join some games and play, you know, I mean, not everyone, but you know what I mean, like just sort of certain folks were just sort of hyper focused. But not even then. I mean, I'm pretty sure our reliability team was like basically like running nonstop for like weeks, like just sort of trying to stay on top of things and iron out any issues and concerns. Um, I can't say what it is, but there was a last minute, glitch that needed to be sorted out, just before we pressed the button, like literally minutes before the button was pressed. And that was addressed quickly, but that required a conversation and some things had to be done there and so on. And so just so it was like a technical issue, but um boy, what an experience. Yeah, like something that I'll never sort of probably live through again, I think.
I mean, it's a testament to how great that game launched. I remember when it came out in 2016, I had just finished university and I played Overwatch. I thought this game is incredible. Like
Mm,
it was all the heroes. I remember when I was young, I played Team Fortress, and I thought this is a really cool game. It just feels a little clunky, and I don't wanna upset anyone who's listening to the stream who loves TF2. I really loved that game when I was a
mm.
kid.
Yeah, it's
But
great.
when I played Overwatch, I was just like, this is TF2, but like in a really polished, kind of easy way to play, and they're all the champions or heroes feel very unique. I just remember I had such a great time playing when it first came out. How did the growth period go as kind of the game was out and like in the wild? Like, were there any kind of adjustments that you and your team had to make as the game got more and more popular? But obviously, there are always balancing concerns, or you have to maybe open or close different servers to support worldwide. Just there's a myriad of things that you have to take into account when a game becomes very popular, which is what
That's
happened
right.
to Overwatch.
So, one of the biggest things for the team was actually transitioning from, uh, I guess, development into a live service game. And a live service game is a very interesting and challenging thing, because some developers they work on games, they'll make the game, they'll ship the game, they might do like a patch or something like that to address any bugs or whatever, but then that's it. They might go have a holiday or something and come back and work on the next thing and the game is done. And so that's the box model. But for a live service game, um, it's a whole different thing. And so that was a huge adjustment for the team because you sort of go from a world where you're sort of like, this is what we want to do. And we have a million things we want to do, but we can prioritize those things and we'll work through them and we'll sort of burn down the backlog or whatever. But it's all the things that we think are important for the game and so on. And then you become a live service, and then suddenly you're also have this influx of like, bugs and, balancing and issues and, all these other sort of things that sort of come from that. And then also the players themselves can sometimes influence the direction that designers go and other things like that. Another challenge at the time was that Overwatch League was being born, and that required engineering work as well. And so there was this sort of balance of providing engineering support to Overwatch, the Overwatch League effort, as well as keeping up with, the patches for the game and, everything that we wanted to do. And so, I mean, for example, when Overwatch shipped, competitive wasn't with it. Like it didn't ship with a competitive mode. And so that was something that obviously, we really wanted to do. Um, and there was some strategy behind that, but either way, it was felt like it was very important to get that out the door. And so you're sort of balancing, that against, oh, but here's another competing priority with Overwatch League, and who's going to work on that, etc. And the Overwatch team was always a team where we were often trying to do as much as we possibly could with as few people as possible. And there were some reasons for that. But part of the reason was that the previous game, Titan, was very large, and I think that that created some challenges, for the team. And so there was an aversion, a little bit of an aversion to getting too big too quickly in terms of team size, um, because there were, people were remembered, let's say, fondly, some of the challenges that come with working with very large teams and organizing very large teams. And so there was a you know an aversion to growing too large, and so with that comes challenges. So we have all these competing priorities. We only have so many individuals able to work on the team. That limits what we can do. And so there's the balance of meeting the players' expectations, the designers' expectations, external expectations that come from other areas that are sort of putting pressure as well. Yeah, it's a very difficult mix there to sort of balance appropriately. And then on top of that, the game's very popular. You know, people are saying things, and you're trying to sort of pay attention to some of those things. Um, yeah, it was a very hectic time for the
But
team.
there's what I picked up there is that there's a cost to expanding the team too much. Like, it felt like was it a self-imposed limit where you had 65-person team? I think any average gamer would say, "Blizzard, you have so many games, hire more devs." But it sounds like going beyond that threshold, it kind of, doesn't give the same. It's like more diminishing returns at some point if you have too large of a team.
So at the time when we shipped, I think the team was around about 35 to 40 engineers. So it was actually smaller than what it is today. Um, and again, it wasn't that there was a hard limit or anything like that. There wasn't a cap or any sort of limitation, but there was a strong desire from some of the leadership on the team to avoid growing the team to the point where it became difficult to manage things. And again, as I mentioned earlier, like it took us many years to develop the maturity and the ceremonies and organization, to sort of function well as a team, where it enabled that growth, over time, such that we were able to still, manage things appropriately and without sort of feeling like we're unable to, sort of communicate well or make the right decisions, etc. Um, so it was always that perspective. And as well, try to sort of cast yourself into this mindset as well. When they sort of when they shut down Titan, the previous game, and created Overwatch, they handpicked the folks that they, to sort of move on into Overwatch. And so these are very, sort of capable engineers, sort of, and designers and artists and etc. and product producers. And so they were able to get a lot done. Like it was a very sort of experienced team. Let's say that, like a very senior team. And so it had a lot of very experienced individuals, and so it was very effective at getting a lot done that maybe you would need more people to do if you had a less experienced team or a less a less senior team, let's say. And so they were always sort of in that mindset of we can get more done with a relatively small amount of people. And for a long time it was sort of true, but again, you're sort of making trade-offs as you're sort of going through that world. And I think the right answer there is, and the team did this, is to sort of grow slowly over time and understand what the balance is of the team health, versus, the ambitions of the team and what we want to get done. Um, you know, and so that was, I mean, to be clear, that was always carefully considered. There was never any, insane overtime or, like the team's health was always top priority for the leadership. It was a really fantastic team to be on from that perspective because those things were never serious trade-offs. Um, you know, every now and then there would need to be a little bit of overtime, a burst here, a burst there, but it was never, the whole team for months or something like that. That was never done because it was understood that that would be an unhealthy outcome for the team from that perspective. Again, I wasn't involved in any of those specific decisions. That was at the director level for the team, directorship level. But I always appreciated that it was always very, the leadership were always very considerate towards the team. How can they best support the team so that the team can be successful was basically how they positioned themselves. And yeah, I thought it was really well done.
Yeah, it's no, it's a wonderful thing to hear because again, AAA has kind of the reputation for having crunch, for having kind of a culture where people have to kind of put in a lot of time where it would kind of bleed into their personal life and their health. But to hear that that wasn't the case is very important to know in terms of for a company, but also when it comes to, like, measuring effectiveness of engineers, like, I've worked in various game companies, like, you're looking at kinda producers will measure, like, the story
Yeah,
points delivered per sprint, and there's, like, velocity, and there's all these things, but at the end of the day, like, if you got a really talented engineer, there's so many other things that go around just delivering that branch or delivering that line of code, like, there's a lot of thinking, a lot of communication, a lot of planning
yeah.
that it can't be as simple as saying you didn't deliver this amount of impact in this amount of time, so you're X. It's a convoluted formula.
I think yeah, it definitely is. And while, there wasn't sort of, let's say, significant overtime, folks would take it upon themselves to put that in. Like I said, our live ops team were really sort of significantly busy for a long time after we shipped, and it was sort of a balance of their own sort of passion and professionalism um, against sort of what was necessary to keep the game running well. And there was great I had to take great care with a lot of that stuff, for example, to really talk to people and understand how they're feeling, um, and make sure that they're making the best choices that they can make, in order to, sort of be sustainable. Um, and, it can be very challenging. There are examples I can give in some areas of the team where there are some extremely passionate folks who are amazing contributors, um, and like world class kind of individuals, and they're so passionate about what they're doing. Um, but because of that, they just push so hard, to try to make sure that they do everything they possibly can to support, the folks that are depending on them on the team. Um, and sometimes that small team mindset can work against uh, individuals like that, because they're sort of like, well, if I had a couple more people to help, that would really make a difference. But those, and you sort of try to listen to that and understand what that would look like and then advocate for it and make it happen if you can. But it takes time. Some of these things can be very difficult to recruit for example. Um, and so you sort of hatch the plan and you sort of have the path forward, but then, it could take months or even longer to address that. And in that time, people are still really pushing very hard to try to get an amazing outcome. And it's tough it's a little bit tough to watch, honestly, like, because you sort of see folks that are really so passionate about producing a great outcome, um, but you need to sort of balance that against, sort of like, a healthy approach to getting your job done. and balancing that against your, your sort of work-life balance, right? Um, so yeah, it was a huge challenge for the team from that perspective, and some people did it better than others for sure. And I spent a lot of time with people just chatting with them about that exact topic, for example.
How do you temper that balance? I mean, I'm being very transparent here, but I've in the past have suffered from being very passionate for a project, wanting to get something out. Maybe I've spoken to a lot of the players. I've, to a certain regard, promised that things will come out at a certain date, and
Mm,
you're sometimes you feel like you're pushing against an organizational structure that they hear you, they understand you, but they just can't help you, and it can be very isolating. I'm speaking from my personal experience. It can be isolating
right.
when you really care about an outcome. You're almost coming from the point of view of a player,
Yeah.
and you can't deliver. And there's just there are too many issues. There's a huge backlog. There's a refactor that needs to happen, but that refactor is going to take 4 months, and that's literally a third of the year. And you're like, how on earth are we going to be able to do that with everything else we want to do? And it's just there's this it becomes a very dark space because there's this impending kind of darkness that's just like, no
Mm.
matter what I do, there are always going to be issues, and even if I release this, the players are going to complain about that. And I digress. I'm going on a tangent, but how do you temper that passion when you speak to
It's
engineers
hard.
or
It's
yeah?
tough because you don't want to you don't want to stifle that passion. That passion is the magic. That's what makes games amazing is someone cares, someone wants to champion something, someone really is excited to do something. And you don't want to, it's it's the you need to find a way to help someone understand that, you know, we don't want to swing the pendulum too far away from that passion, but at the same time, we have to be realistic about what's possible and what isn't, um, and why things are possible and why things, maybe a decision goes a certain way for or against or whatever. And so it's incredibly challenging. I worked with multiple engineers who expressed great passion for various different things that were either not realistic in terms of the time available, or perhaps it was challenging from the technical perspective, or perhaps the team didn't agree, and so they thought, they were really passionate about X, but the team felt differently and wanted to go in a different direction. It's tough. It's tough. I mean, there's no magic sort of secret to that. Really, it's just spend time talking to people, understand their perspective, help them understand the other aspects of why, that may or may not be a good idea. And it could be because of their own personal health. It could be because of, decisions the team has made. It could be because of certain realities, like I said, with the tech or other things like that. Um, and, ideally, you get to a spot where it's like, hey, maybe this isn't right for now, but maybe in the future that is a possibility, or maybe something changes that enables that. Or maybe we just have more time later and now is not the right time or whatever. But yeah, it's not an easy thing because there is no sort of definitive right answer where everyone is satisfied. It's just one of those things where you have to, use some empathy and try to understand, the perspective and where people are coming from. Maybe there are opportunities to channel those passions in other directions, and so you don't get the same outcome, but maybe a similar outcome. But you have to be really careful about not committing to things that you can't sort of, realistically promise in the future, and all sorts of other things. So there's all sorts of aspects to that. Um, but yeah, that's just one of the challenges I suppose that come with working with highly creative people is that yeah, they are gonna, sort of like get these ideas that are super exciting and really wonderful ideas sometimes. They're just amazing. Other times maybe not as much, but it just depends, right? And then there's that question of how do we realistically deliver it?
So in terms of career development and growth, Summer, how do you help engineers kind of understand what growth is for the next level? Like
Mm.
everyone's trying to kind of rise the chain. At the end of the day, you're working a job. You're there to get a better salary, to get more responsibility, and to grow personally because you're ambitious and you want to deliver more. How does that translate for you?
So you need a few elements for that, ideally that are in place. It really helps to have really good description of what each of those levels actually means in the context of the company or the team. um, because it's a reference that you can look at together and help someone understand what the difference is between an associate engineer and a mid-level engineer and a senior engineer and beyond. Um, and so typically when I'm working with engineers to help them understand what that could look like, that's the shared frame of reference that I like to start with is, okay, you're a mid-level engineer and you'd like to become a senior. Well, why don't we look at what we expect of a mid-level engineer? And these should all be very familiar to you. Now let's look at the senior level description as well. And understand what the delta is between the two and talk about that. And so you may see some of the things at the senior level that you're already doing or that are familiar to you, but maybe some things that are not. And I think that's a valuable place to start, but it's not the full conversation because there are other aspects that matter in that context as well. For example, the lead that the engineer is working with may have their own expectations or perspective. It's also, we need to maybe also consider that the engineer has their own interpretation of themselves. And their degree of self-awareness matters there as well. So some folks maybe feel that, they're very humble or they have imposter syndrome and they're, sort of thinking like, hey, I'm not even good enough to be at my current level, versus others who are sort of thinking, well, I should be at the top level, and why am I not there? And so it is important to contextualize a person's level with concrete examples or data that we can use to better understand how they're contributing and also how they want to contribute. And so you might look at these engineering levels and say, all right, well, um, here's what we expect of a mid-level. Here's what we expect of a senior. Here's a specific behavior in senior that we haven't yet had a chance to do yet, or you haven't had a chance to demonstrate. Where might you be excited to contribute so that we can start to, see you demonstrate some of that work? And, oh, well, there's this project and, I really want to do X, Y, and Z. Well, amazing. That's exactly what we're looking for. Typically, when we're working with engineers and we want to promote engineers, you really want to see the majority of those next level behaviors emerging or even fairly comfortably being delivered. And so when you promote them, they're not immediately sort of failing at their level because they just got there and they're sort of not sort of exhibiting some of those behaviors. And so typically you'd sort of want to coach someone such that they're sort of approaching the expectations at the next level. And somewhere in there is the time where you want to sort of recognize that and promote them accordingly. Um, the best way for an engineer to do anything, um, in terms of, if you zoom out and you sort of say, all right, what should I do as an engineer to be successful? Now, there's a million things that you could sort of say that constitute success as an engineer. But in general, the loop is basically be assigned work, complete the work to a degree of quality that's acceptable or better, and um, and then spend some time to what I call do a mini review. And so take on some work, complete the work, and then sit with your lead and say to your lead, here's how I think it went. Here's how I think I would do things differently next time. And are there any action items that we need to take away from this? And then have your lead do the same with you. What did they see went well and didn't go well, and what are the action items in order to improve, the next go around, and then rinse and repeat. And so, if you do that consistently, as you sort of go through these levels, um, you will see improvement, a market improvement as you go forth through that iteration loop, because you're doing a very fast form of feedback as well. And I'm talking about like things that might be like, hey, take this on, it's a week's worth of work or something chunky that you can sort of get into some discussion about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, um, and then spend the time to retrospect the work. And so those little mini reviews or mini retrospectives are incredibly valuable, sort of feedback touch points that help you calibrate. And so maybe next time you might say, all right, the action items for next time is that you'll spend a little more time looking at the code before you start writing the code to offset any unknowns that plagued you this time around or something like that, right? And so you can often identify these little tweaks that can be made, and then you can start applying them, and ideally it's no longer an issue the next time around or the time after that, and you find new things. And as you go, this is the nature of engineering. It's always something different problems, different issues, different challenges. And as the complexity grows, you'll come across other sort of challenges that you weren't aware of or something that you didn't know how to do. And it'll exhibit during the development, and then the feedback will help you understand, how to address that, and then you get another chance, and on you go. And it can, again, this is super zoomed out, but that's basically what that iteration loop looks like. And if you can do that well, then you'll fast track your growth pretty effectively. You also need a lead who's paying attention and is capable of giving you good feedback and constructive feedback, which is important. You need, sort of a clearly defined um, iteration loop of how work is done. So we have sprints, and you get assigned work during the sprint, and you have to write some documentation and do some things, and whatever else is that leads to the definition of done, and then you move forward. And so yeah,
I mean,
that's
there's a high degree of transparency that you have to have, like, a
oh,
transparency and
absolutely,
like what you do well, what you think you've done well, and being proud of that. I think I achieved the definition of done with these tasks, and
yeah,
I think I've delivered a quality work here and here, but then also transparency and where can I get better? And I think that's
that's
sometimes tricky for people because like by admitting your weakness, you'd be like,
yeah,
I'm never going to get promoted now because now that
hmm,
engineer B does that better because there's a
yeah,
lot of self-comparison in these
of
organizations, and
course,
there are a lot of
of
people
course.
competing for one role. Like there can only be one person
That's
often getting that position. So how do you balance that in a candid way? Because maybe an employee will disagree.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a challenge. I think it's important though, because I think with that level of transparency, that's where you can really get to the nitty-gritty of what needs to be said and done, so that you can be as efficient as possible in understanding how to improve. Because if you put off those discussions, or you sort of feel awkward about sharing that level of feedback, then how's the person going to learn from that and grow? And so I get it as an engineer. If you're a little bit there's two sort of extremes on that spectrum. One is that folks that are relatively humble, they don't like to toot their own horn either, and so they're not going to say, I did this and it was amazing, But on the other hand, maybe they're not also going to say I did that and it wasn't great. And I think one of the skills that can really help you in your career as you grow, just as in anything that you do, is the ability to sort of look at yourself, that self reflection, and understand, I did these things. What was great there and what didn't go so well, and why? And if you know that I did a thing and it was great, cool. Well, understand that so you can keep doing that next time. Like, yeah, it was a good idea to go and talk to this person before I, did this, because they know about the system. So cool. Next time I'll always identify who the other people are experienced in the system, and I'll go and talk to them, because that behavior is good. That's a pattern that's helpful. On the other hand, yeah, I submitted my code without a code review. Well, that's against policy, or maybe, that resulted in breaking the build and people got upset. All right, well, I mean, that's an obvious one, but I'm not going to do that again because I don't want to upset people. Um, but recognizing that it was you, and you caused that is
Oh,
exactly what that's all about.
apologies. I don't know what's going on with my camera.
Yeah, it looks like I lost you there. Oh,
Okay,
there.
I'm back. There we go. Sorry about that. But yeah, that makes total sense. And when it comes to supporting new leads, like how
Mm.
does that work with someone kind of transitioning into that role and you gotta help them out as they're kind of trying to figure out like their first steps?
So the good thing about leads, and it's not always true, but generally it's true, that they're usually fairly experienced engineers themselves. And so they, at the very least, they know what it's like to sort of progress through the levels and to mature into a stronger engineer. But being a lead is a whole extra layer on top of all of that. Um, and the way that I approach that in general is, especially with a lead who hasn't had a lot of experience or maybe even no experience. Um, but assuming, let's just say that it's an engineer who's internal, and so they're familiar with the code base, the people, and the way things are done, but they've moved from an IC into a lead position. Um, and typically, they'll go through the usual sort of series of fears. Am I doing a good job? Am I making the right decisions? Am I being helpful to my team, the people I'm responsible for? Am I prioritizing correctly? And all these different things that sort of go through your head. And it's a very nerve-wracking experience, honestly, for folks when they first step into that role, because they don't want to let people down. They don't want to let folks down. They don't want to let the team down. And they don't want to come across as, a bad lead, let's say. Um, the way that leads work at Blizzard, where I was mostly, is that they're both responsible for the tech and the people. And so they do some people management, and they do, the technical ownership as well. And when you're a lead in that context, the challenges are twofold because you have to make good decisions about the direction of the tech, which usually they're most comfortable with, let's say. And then you need to involve yourself in coaching and growing your team and so on. And so a lot of the emphasis or the focus that we start with are things around, how to coach individuals on your team, how to get the best use out of one-on-ones, for example, how to give someone some feedback, whether it's positive feedback or constructive feedback. Um, and so on. And usually I find the best way to do that is to meet regularly and talk. So I was catching up. I had 10 leads that were reporting to me on the team. And so I'd catch up with them once a week, but also ad hoc if necessary, where we would talk through the team and, I'd have them sort of talk me through each of the individuals on the team, what's going on, how are they doing, what's top of mind for you there, et cetera. And out of that, things would come up that would be like, oh, they're coming in late, or they're doing this, or they're doing that, or something that needs some correction. And we'd talk through it. We'd role play it, talk through it. I'd give them some ideas or some, sort of suggestions on how they could approach that, because that was a discussion that they needed to have with their report. Um, in extreme cases, I might be involved in that discussion, etc. But it was all about providing them with support, the necessary support to feel like they could do their job comfortably. And it wasn't just coaching; it's also production and uh, prioritizations and other things. But for the most part, where I was involved most was helping them understand how to be a people manager. Um, and therein there are all sorts of different things that apply there, um, but not least of which is that iteration loop that I mentioned earlier about, hey, it's really important to pay attention to what's going on around you, that mindfulness of like, hey, what's happening around me, um, and so you can provide that feedback in a timely fashion. Like, hey, this was amazing, you did a really great job there. When I reviewed the code, it was fantastic, not an issue at all. Or, hey, this is where you could use some work, and here's some ideas that I have there. Or, what ideas do you have? Let's talk about it, so then I can validate those ideas or give you additional information.
Yeah.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because there are people that are better than that than others. It's at the end of the day, when you're working in a business, it's people with people. Like
Yeah,
they're trying to interact with each other. They're trying to help each other. They're trying to either compliment or perhaps give some constructive criticism. But not everyone knows how to do it in the same capacity. So like having a
exactly.
culture and having kind of a way of kind of coaching people to treat kind of their colleagues or their teammates or their leads or their managers in a way where it's productive at the end of the day. It's not personal.
Yeah,
Sometimes you do have to
exactly.
say uncomfortable things, and it's a tricky balance. I think
Yeah,
that's why
it,
management is important in games as much as
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, it is a delicate balance for sure. I think the superpower of that though, especially when you have this culture with these values together with an opportunity to work across all leads. So like if I'm working with 10 leads, I'm taking a consistent approach to the way that I'm discussing these things, coaching these leads, etc. So it's really important because then you get a consistent approach, a relatively consistent approach across the team itself as well. And so you can sort of hold everyone accountable to to these expectations of what leadership should be and how we conduct ourselves, how we support our team, and so on. It's critically important. And so this, in developing each of those leads individually, you're also developing a bench of leads, so to speak. Like the entire front line there. With the same sort of values and mindsets, I suppose, to approaching some of these challenges. Everyone's unique and everyone's different in their own way. It's never, exactly the same, of course, but um, you know, these are things that we can, do together to help make that happen. Um, for example, we introduced on Overwatch a meeting. It was it's my favorite meeting. It's called the Leads thing, and this meeting is just the leads, and it's a safe place where we can talk about anything that's relevant to getting our job done, basically. And it was once a fortnight, every fortnight, and it was just a chance for leads to share some of their victories, some of their challenges. Hey, I'm working with someone who exhibits this behavior, and I'm trying to coach them in this direction, and I'm not having any luck. does anyone have any ideas on that? Or, oh yeah, I work with that individual and here's the key to that. Or, oh yeah, that happened with on my team and this is what we did. And, that also helps to build that cohesion and that sort of, collaborative and collective sort of, approach to coaching and, leadership on the team. Yeah, it was really effective, really fantastic.
And what roles and rituals did you have internally? Like we talk about, like I think people from the outside know about like the sprint ceremony and
Yes.
kind of how did that work in Overwatch often?
So, broadly speaking, in Overwatch, one of the coolest things that the team ever did, it was my first introduction to the team at large was through this format. They call it game check-in. And so there's a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday meeting in the morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time where, they get sort of, it's an all hands meeting where they just, give some updates and talk about some things. And that was brilliant because it's sort of, it's an opportunity to sort of put things in front of the team because the team can get, large. And I mean, well, the team is large. And so it can be difficult to know what everyone's doing. And so, every now and then someone will come up in front of the team and talk about X, Y, and Z. It's also for administrative reasons and other things like that, but also celebrations too. And there is a milestone review version of that where, that we share things that, folks have done, as well, just to celebrate that. Um, so that was an awesome meeting. We did all sorts of things in the anniversary celebrations and, like for people who have been on the team for so many years and so on and so forth. It was really good fun. Um, that was a very valuable meeting. For engineering, we had a weekly engineering leads meeting, and that's just more of a technical meeting where we had some production and QA and other folks in there as well, and we're talking about the ins and outs of getting things done. We had the biweekly or the fortnightly leads thing meeting, which was sort of more casual, sort of a safe place to have that kind of discussion. And then we had our monthly engineering all hands, where we'd encourage engineers to share a bit about themselves through a presentation, just some of their background and things they've done, just so we can get to know the team a little bit better as we go roll through. Um, and a chance for the leads to share updates on various things that were important. Hey, we've made a change to the coding standard, and this is why and what it is, things like that. And so it wasn't, and each of these sub teams they had their own ceremonies as well, their daily stand ups or whatever they did, their weekly planning meetings, and other things, social things that they would do as well. To enable good sort of camaraderie communication etc. And so pulling all that together, I mean there were other meetings, production related and other things like that, director level meetings and so on, but pulling all of that together meant that there was a pretty reasonable sort of opportunity to sort of see each other and talk to each other and so on, in various different formats. And I will say, like that was really important. Like without those meetings, you would sort of be in the dark in many respects.
I've had an amazing time summer, by the way. This has
Mm,
been an amazing conversation. Usually, where I gear up towards the end is like some advice. So it'll be like advice for people listening in that maybe they want to work as engineers or they want to work better with engineers. So, kind of,
right.
I guess the first question would be for professionals listening: what makes a great engineer? Whether that may be a manager or an IC, what are you looking for when you're hiring someone into your team?
Mm. Well, I can talk about what makes a great engineer. It's a little trickier to talk about when you're hiring because it's difficult to fully understand, it then becomes a question of like how great an interviewee are you? You know, and some engineers are terrible at doing interviews, but they're amazing engineers, and so that's a challenge. But what makes a great engineer is curiosity, um, a degree of humility, um, obviously passion and excitement for solving problems or writing code or helping others, because there's sort of different flavors of engineering in game development when it comes to what gets people excited. And some people they just love to solve problems, like here's a really complex challenge, solve the problem. um, some people love helping others, and so, an artist comes to you and says, "I want this. Can we do it?" And you really wanna, you get excited helping that artist. Other people just love writing code. Like they just really enjoy, I guess it sort of borders into solving problems, but it's basically like, hey, I just love writing systems and, you know, making things that I'm the owner of and that, I can sort of continue to support. Um, but what makes a great engineer is some of those attributes I mentioned earlier. So, passion and a little humility and curiosity. Um, I like to talk about something called uh, I'm blanking out on it. It's so weird. Um, just sort of being in the moment. And
Mm,
so this is about just sort of being aware of your surroundings. Who's doing what, who needs help that you can help, um, who's not sure about something, who's going in a direction that maybe is worth talking about. And so that sort of uh, just having that mindfulness is the word I was looking for. The mindfulness of what's going on around you at any given moment, especially if you're working together in a physical office, can be quite valuable. Some of the best engineers that I worked with were folks that were, sort of tuned into what everyone was doing and lending their support and assistance and even when they didn't need to, there weren't leads or managers, but they were just senior engineers who, just wanted to sort of make sure that we were making the best possible features. And so they would pay attention or they would chime in or help out. Um, and especially with more junior engineers when they would coach and mentor and just provide guidance, understanding that that time was valuable, not because it enabled them to get their work done, but enabled others to get their work done, or maybe, improve the quality of the feature that they were making or something like that. And so I think, the best engineers that I work with were folks like that. Um, and then in terms of like finding people like that, yeah, I mean, again, like some of those attributes do come out when you talk to people in interviews, and you can get a sense that they are able to communicate reasonably well. We emphasize that a lot on the team is get out of your seat and talk to people, a little harder in a hybrid scenario, but again, it's the emphasis is on communication, sharing information, going above and beyond to make sure that people understand either A, what you're doing or B, what you've done. So that, there's good visibility into that. And so we'll encourage tech talks or other things like that, or even just like, let's say you're going to work on a feature and you go and look at it a bit and understand what you're going to do, and maybe then you'll put together a few bullet points of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it roughly, and then send it out to all the engineers on your team and say, hey, I'm starting this next week, here's what I think I'm doing, if anyone has opinions about it, let me know. And that saved us from lots of different scenarios where, someone has some domain knowledge that's important or they weren't expecting it. And, whoa, hold on a second. Is that what you're doing? Okay, well, let's talk about that. Um, it can be as simple as or subtle as that that makes a difference in that context. But just getting back to the topic, yeah. I think it helps to be passionate about what you do. So, in the sense that you've done things. So, if you're an engineer and you haven't had a chance to work in games, work on your own little projects at home. Like have a GitHub repo or something like that. I mean, AI is really sort of getting capable now and making stuff quickly. Like, learn that, get familiar with it, and make games. So that you can talk about how you solve some of the problems that may be things that the game team are looking for as well. Um, so it's all about building up your experience in those areas as well, particularly if you haven't been working on a game. And if you have, be ready to share examples of problems that you solved, I guess.
Summer, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been a true pleasure to have chatted with you today.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, really appreciate being here with you and chatting through all these.